You are listening to Up to Me Radio, the best in inspirational talk radio. It's up to me.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to Coffee with Kim. I invite you to journey with me to a new day. I believe God has led you to this moment and this place because He is about to bring purpose and potential to your story. So join thousands of women and men from around the globe who have discovered how powerful their stories become once Christ touches them with His purpose. Don't you long to make this same discovery? Then grab your coffee, scoot in, and join me as we let God's Word reveal how every part of your past has been preparing you for this very moment. Do you have a question about the Bible's authenticity that you've never really had answered? Are you having trouble sharing a conversation with the Bible with maybe unbelievers? Do you want to dig deeper and know how to present your case for Christ in times such as this? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then friends, this show today is for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coffee, conversations of friends of faith to encourage and equip. I'm Kim Crabill, your host, and I'm delighted about today's show. So grab your coffee, grab your pen, grab your paper. You're going to want to take notes. Also, you want to write down this number, 347-324-5246, because you can call in and ask today's guest your question. 347-324-5246 and press 1. So who is our guest today? Have I intrigued you enough with all of these questions? Well, he is none other than J. Warner Wallace, the cold case homicide detective, popular national speaker and author of Cold Case Christianity. He has been featured many times on Dateline. He is a popular national speaker. Of course, he's a best-selling author. He has his own TV show. I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to bring him on and let him tell us more about himself. So welcome to Coffee, Mr. J. Warner Wallace. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm happy to do it. We're on a 3-hour difference here across the country. I'm glad to be with you.
I know you are up early. It's 10 o'clock in Baltimore, and it's 7 your time?
Yeah, it's 7 o'clock here in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, so across from across the states we're talking today, and I feel like that's always important for our listeners to hear, because many times people think that we're sitting side by side, and so when we start interrupting one another, it's easier to understand when they realize that the distance that's between us. So anyway, well, welcome to the show. You know, we met at NRB this past year, and I hosted a breakfast for the TV host who had programs on NRB, and had the opportunity to meet you and hear you, and was just overwhelmed with your knowledge and all that you bring to the table and what you do. It's really funny for me to hear the apologetics professor in you, and to know that it all began in someone who proclaimed to be an atheist. How about that?
Yeah, I think sometimes a lot of us, are probably have taken that similar journey. I know that a good friend of mine, Lee Strobel, has got a similar approach. He was an investigative journalist, has a law degree. I was in law enforcement for working as a detective for probably coming up on 8 or 9 years before I got interested in examining what the Bible had to say about Jesus of Nazareth. And so I was, a very committed atheist. I was about 35, and I was somebody who, unlike Lee, Lee was trying to really investigate what his wife Leslie had discovered, and to kind of prove her wrong, because he was upset that she had become a Christian. But that wasn't my situation. I didn't think there was, my wife and I we didn't become Christians until we were together for about 18 years. And I thought this is not even worth examining. This is such a fairy tale that there was, who spends time examining whether or not there's an Easter bunny? Probably not a lot of people do that. That's not worth your time. And that's really how I saw Christianity in those days.
Wow. Well, now you talked a lot there that I want our audience to get to know you a little bit better. And you talked a little bit about your family. You talked about your occupation there a little bit. So tell us about your family, or let's just talk about Jim, the person, your dad, your husband.
Yeah, I've got 4 kids, and they're all grown now. They are all 31 to 23. So they are out of the house, and so we're by ourselves again, and that's kind of a neat stage to be in at this point. And I was in law enforcement working as a detective. I did mostly cold cases, which are just unsolved murders, and Dateline loves unsolved murders, so we've been on Dateline quite a bit. Kind of, we're in Los Angeles County, so that's part of it too, right? Because NBC Universal is right here up the road, so we get a chance to kind of partner with them on these cases, and you learn a lot doing that. And that's really the same approach that I took when I began looking at Christianity. I kind of thought, to be honest, that everyone did that. I thought, at the time, doesn't everyone, like, why would you decide this is true and give your life to it if you didn't examine it? And all the evidence that supports it or works against it, to know with certainty, evidentially, that this is true. But as I, became a Christian and met other Christians, I realized that I was really in the minority group that would take that approach. As a matter of fact, I've written another book called Forensic Faith, just talking about what I discovered after becoming a Christian in terms of the way that most of us enter into this system, enter into this belief, and it's not usually evidentially. Or if it's evidentially, it's on the basis of a personal, untested experience. If you don't, you know what I mean. In other words,
yes,
when people will ask me all the time, "What is your testimony?" And I'm always reluctant to give it. I think our testimonies are important, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is this true? And when you ask Christians, most Christians, why are you a Christian? You'll find that most of us will say something like, well, I was raised that way. I was raised in the church. I brought up this way. My parents were Christians. That's the number one answer. The number two answer is I've had some kind of an experience, maybe an answered prayer, a transformation in my own life. I saw something, I felt something that demonstrated for me that Christianity is true. And the reason why, as an atheist, most of us, when we hear those kinds of explanations, are like, yeah, really? Because everyone says that. But I've got family. Most of them are all atheists, but I do have my dad's second wife was Mormon, and they had 6 kids together, and they're all raised LDS. And if you ask my LDS siblings, why are you a member of the Mormon Church? They'll say, well, I was raised that way. Or number 2, I had an experience of the Holy Spirit that confirmed for me that Joseph Smith's a prophet and the Book of Mormon is true. Well, okay, we all do this. Doesn't mean it's true. We would say that their reasons for believing the Book of Mormon is true are insufficient. They haven't tested it. And, of course, if they did, they'd find it was not true. But most of us as Christians respond like Mormons anyway, and we haven't tested it either to know if Christianity is true. And that's where I think I've kind of dedicated my work for the last 10 years or so.
But, Jim, don't you think that that's why it's so easy to fall away from it? If we don't have the facts, if we base it just purely on feelings, then when we do get in conversations and we don't look as wise as we should, when we can't come back with the authentic facts or the things that you presented in your books, it began to look very shallow. And so, we talk about with the falling away of this new generation, kids go away to school. Well, maybe they're just not equipped to really take their stand and to build their case against others who can come at them.
Well, I think that's true, and also look at I used an illustration that I think it probably makes sense. Is that I had a case one time. I was working officer-involved shootings where a guy was an officer. A bad guy got the draw on him before he could even pull his gun out of his holster, and this guy was pointing a gun right at the officer's chest, and he was probably about 7 feet away. Not a good situation, and so the officer had a couple of choices. He could thought about ducking or diving, or he was too far away to do like a gun takeaway. He was kind of in a bad situation, but he knew he was wearing his bulletproof vest. And those of us who have worn bulletproof vests, we've seen those vests tested in the range, so we know that you can shoot bullets at those and they will not penetrate the vest. It'll hurt, but you will not. It will not penetrate the vest. And so he just decided that to tense up his stomach muscles and take the first couple of rounds as he's getting his gun out of his holster, rather than do anything else crazy. He had the confidence to stand. And I always thought, when I listened to that story in real time as he's telling it to me, I thought to myself, wow, this guy moved from belief that something is true to belief in that thing. And that shift from belief that to belief in was done on the basis of the fact that he had seen that vest stop the bullets in the range as a test. And so for a lot of our young people, we want them to move from belief that to belief in, so they'll trust something, they won't walk away from it, they'll be devoted to it, they'll put their faith in it. But it turns out that that process that he went through in the range actually is part of the process that moved him in that direction. If he didn't know in advance, we haven't shown our kids in advance that this system that we call Christianity actually can respond to all the objections, and it can stop the bullets, and then you ought to trust it in that time of crisis, because that time of crisis is coming for all of us, and you want to know that evidentially that this thing is true. We've tested it, and I can now trust it.
Yes. I love that. I love that. And you said something that I want to go back to. You talked about, our time of testing will definitely be here. Boy, what do you think about the time that we're actually in right now, Jim? I mean, being in law enforcement, and I just honor you. I read somewhere where your father was in law enforcement, you're in law enforcement, and your son is in law enforcement. So I'd love to talk about that. But that is just so touching to me because my brother, who I just love and adore, retired from 35 years in the law enforcement. And, from the time he started until the time he ended, wow, how things have changed. What is your perspective on what's going on in our world today with the law enforcement and the things that you've just talked about?
Well, okay, so it's tough, right? Because, I'm probably like your brother. When I entered into law enforcement, I watched my dad work in the profession, and I saw it as this noble calling, even though I was not somebody who probably believed in callings at the time. But I saw it as, and I have a bachelor's degree in design, and I have a master's degree in architecture. I was working as an architect when I felt like, the profession of my father was calling me, and so I ended up in the same career that he did after having a master. I was a little bit older when I joined, and now my son, we all have the same name, Jim Wallace. We've all been in the same agency with the same name for coming up on be 59 years.
Wow.
So we've been connected. I had a chance to watch law enforcement over that span of 59 years, and look, I will tell you this: the answer to all the issues we're seeing right now is not in won't be found in the kind of the houses of government. It's going to be found in the heart of humans. The problem is not that the solution is not government. The solution is and not law enforcement. The solution is the gospel, and the gospel changes everything, because the problem we have that we would say is systemic. I mean, look, I don't to say that there's a systemic problem in law enforcement kind of overstates the nature of law enforcement, because it's not like there's this governmental oversight that controls every agency. In our county in Los Angeles, there's probably 36 different municipal agencies that have their own ethos, their own strategy, their own kind of nature of their officers, their own leadership structure. There's not like a transcendent overriding system. So you might, on one side of the road here, be in one agency's jurisdiction, and they might have a very different approach than across the street. And so it's kind of hard to generalize then, well, what are law enforcement officers like here? Because there are so many. It's not all LAPD. There's Los Angeles County is this massive region of municipal cities. Glendale's got its own PD. Burbank's got its own PD. I mean, so it's really hard to say there's a systemic problem, because that assumes that there's a system in place that governs all of these agencies, and there really isn't. But there is one thing they all have in common, and there's where the systemic problem lies: is they all employ humans, and humans are systemically what I call otherists. It's not about race, because if we were all the same race, if we were all the same sex, same physical appearance, same height, if we all had the same name, we would find some way to divide from one another, because in our core, we want to be drawn to those who are like us, and there's science on this, and we want to push away those who are other than us. I call this otherism. Now, it manifests itself in sexism and racism and all kinds of other isms. But the core problem is really even deeper than all of those, and it's that humans, you're far more likely to marry somebody or to hang out with people who share your interests, who before you even know you share the same interests. They've done studies on personality tests in which they took a look at people who hang out together at work, and they find out that when they give them all the different personality tests and the Myers-Briggs, they all end up having the same kind of profiles because we don't even know we're drawn to this. We even did a test. They even did a test in which the DNA of married couples is far more similar than the DNA of we find each other. We're drawn to each other's DNA. Now that's so interesting to me. And I saw this, by the way, in my family. I've got family who are German. They live in southern Germany, and they are very close to the Austrian border. But they divide from Austrians, even though that border was only drawn after World War II, even though they share the same language, the same culture pretty much, same foods, same kinds of music. It's very similar culturally. But there's a divider there between them, and they see this, and they have great national pride. They're otherists. Those are the others. You also see this in gang maps in Los Angeles County, where people who are very much ethnically the same, culturally the same, you might even have a cousin who's on the other side of the gang border, and you are now divided from that person because you've drawn these lines in the sand in which we look for ways to separate from each other. This is the nature of humanity, and this is why the only solution. I can put in laws to force you all to look like you don't feel this way, but in the end, only the gospel will change the way you think and feel. Because all the laws do is they're outside in. They just control behavior, but they don't control your heart. So you'll end up, I don't want people who are trying to look good. I want people who actually have been changed. And I don't think you can get there through a governmental system. You're going to have to get there through the gospel.
And what you're talking about, I just love the study of people. As a counselor, I love being able to, go into their minds and be able to untangle, so many of the lies and all the condemnations and all the things that we've put upon ourselves that really compel us to want to be bigger and better than everyone else around us, that otherism that you're talking about, to stand out. When Christ has already made us that way, our DNA, the number of hair on our heads, everything has made us so unique within the confines of how he wants us to be. And it's, if we could just find our uniqueness in that and being able to glorify the Lord in our own personal callings. But, it seems to me that we're moving farther and farther away from this. But you have some incredible books, Jim, that I've been reading and listening to so many of your interviews. And it's just your first, I don't think this is your first book, but Forensic Faith. This is just an incredible book. And I want to talk about this because you call it your gateway book. You say it's not a book that people need to end on or finish on. This is like the gateway book. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, a lot of this was, as I was traveling around the country and asked to come and speak at churches and conferences about the evidence for Christianity. Why should we believe that Christianity is true? Well, a lot of times, especially in churches, I would get asked not by the lead pastor, who really, to be honest with you, had no interest at all in apologetics, but I was asked by a deacon or an elder or somebody at the church who had influence with the lead pastor, who could say, hey, you know what, you need a break once in a while. Why don't you consider bringing in Jim Wallace? And he'll take the pulpit for that weekend. Well, what is he about? He's an apologist. I can tell you, I would get to these churches and be introduced to the pastor, and I could see right away, this pastor does not want me there. He does not see a value in apologetics, and I get it.
I can't imagine. I truly cannot imagine.
And I can tell that the elder who's I'm sitting next to, he's the one who brought me, or is an associate pastor who gets it, he brought me. So I realized that after writing a book that makes the case for Christianity, which is Cold Case Christianity, and then writing a book that makes the case for God's existence from science, that's called God's Crime Scene, I needed to write a book that makes the case for making the case. Because a lot of people are like, well, you know what? I don't really need that because I'm already in the club, and I love Jesus and I love reading my Bible, and I don't really need to know how it's supported by archaeology or by history I don't need to know any of that stuff. Well, how about this? Do you have kids? If you have kids who are high schoolers, Gen Z, Well, then you need to know this, because it turns out that you may not feel like this is something that's valuable to you 25 years into your faith walk. But high schoolers don't really believe it's true, and they don't want to tell you while they're living with you.
Right.
They don't believe it's true. And that is what the
Right.
statistics, we wrote a book called So the Next Generation Will Know, in which we just talk about what's happening to Gen Z. High schoolers, for the most part, when you poll people, we already know the numbers are not great in terms of how many young people in college are no longer part of a church and really have no desire to be part of a church once they leave their parents. And we have a tendency to think that that's happening at the college. Like colleges are, we know, we get it. Colleges are very secular, very much philosophically natural. They don't really believe in, unless you send your kid to a Christian university, and even then, you may not have the greatest experience as far as affirming your faith. But the point is, it turns out that it's not the university that is turning kids away from the faith, because when we ask them at 20 or 22, when did you first start to think that Christianity wasn't true? They'll tell you when they first thought it was, and it's always between the ages of 10 and 17. They're still with us during those years. It's before they got. Now, look, when they get to the university will definitely affirm what they already think is true. But they already think it's true that the Christianity is false, right? That there is no God. And a lot of that, is I used to always say it. If you want to go I was a youth pastor for years, bivocationally. I was working cold cases. I was also a youth pastor, and I can tell you that I used to tell my kids all the time: if you want to go and walk away from your faith in college because you want to chase your passions, I get that. I was not a Christian in college. Okay, I wasn't a Christian for another 10 years, but I'll tell you, if you do that, that's on you. But if you're going to go and move away from university, move away from Christianity, leave it because you don't think it's true, evidentially, well, that's on me. And as parents, I think that's how this works. Yes, a lot of our kids, the tail that wags the dog often is just that they want to chase their passions. I get that. But if they don't think it's true, evidentially, and they've been persuaded by the internet atheists that it's not true, well, that's really on me, because my job was to inoculate my kids to know enough about what is true so they would spot the lie before it was told. And that's really, I think, our job as parents.
Wow, that right there, every parent needs to hear that, because it's so easy for us to throw blame to someone else, or there you just bring it right back to the person. And I feel like that is so much part of the training. We raised two boys. They're also men now. My last one just graduated from medical school. Thank God we don't have to pay that tuition anymore.
Right. I did the same. I did the same thing, but my son had to pay his own medical school tuition. We could do the bachelor's. He had to do that one.
Yeah. Well, we helped as best as we could, but it's for us to sit back and think that this is just as necessary, more necessary than making sure that they have their piano classes or they go to soccer. It's to integrate that in part of our teaching and take that to the highest level of what needs to be done, I think is really important. It's something else that I think that maybe many parents aren't comfortable with because they haven't read your books and know what you're talking about, that it's not a part of what we are thinking about, and so we don't talk about it as often. Deuteronomy admonishes us to, when we rise, to talk about it. As we walk, talk about it, to write it on the walls. But this is how I believe that our young people really make it a part of who they are, and they begin to understand it. And they begin to understand that it really is more than just a feeling. There are some facts to it. Well, I want to get into, Jim, there's so much that I'd love to get into, but I think that I know that we have some questions that are waiting, and I know that we need to take a commercial break in just a minute. But what I'd like to do is, my goal in having you on today, more than anything, is I want the audience to get to know you. I want them to be able to know your book so that they can dissect it and read this on their own and build themselves, because I do feel like Christianity, our belief, needs to be more than a feeling. We must have the facts. Our world is getting to a place where that is necessary. We must be able to put facts to what we're saying. And I want our audience today to be able to walk away with a few pointers on how to really stand up for their faith, how to make their case for their faith so that they can speak more intellectually on it. And you have given to us I can't remember which of the books, you can tell me, but you talk about how the evidence, you give our audience the evidence to use as the answer, how to answer in and out of season. You've given us 5 reasons that we can trust the Bible. You know what I'm talking about? Written early can be
absolutely.
Yeah, so I want to come back and I want to talk about those. We'll have about 30 minutes to talk about that. So, listeners, I want you to grab your pens and pencils because this is really important. In the world where we live in today, where things that should seem right or are right are being portrayed as wrong, and what is wrong seems to be portrayed as right, that's all what the Bible says is going to happen. And so we have to learn how to be able to stand firm. So, Jim, what we're going to do is we're going to take a 30-second break. And then we're going to come back, and being the cold case detective that you are, I want you to teach us how to use our detective skills and how to truly build a case for Christ in our lives so that we can stand firm and be the ultimate in winning others to Christ. So we'll be back in about 30 seconds, okay?
Okay.
There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19. This message brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Coffee. We're so delighted to have you today. We're especially delighted to have with us cold case detective, teacher, author, TV host, Jim Wallace. What an incredible opportunity to have him for an entire hour. Before we leave today, we'll be giving you ways to reach him and to follow him because we know that after today's show, you're definitely going to want to do that if you haven't already. Before we get back to him, I'd like to invite you to like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/rosesandrainbows or visit our website at kimcrabill.org. Each morning we have a live devotional there. We're doing during the month of June a study, a talk on joy. We're getting our joy on in the midst of what's going on in this world. Why is that so important? Because the joy of the Lord is our strength. We need to learn how to stand firm in what's going on and represent Jesus in our world. If you would like, you can tune in to our teachings on our NRB TV and Inspiration TV, Parables TV, and we have more stations that are taking our teachings, our Coffee with Kim, where we take our radio shows, like we're doing today with Jim, and turn it into a TV show. So you can check your local listings to see about where you can tune in for us. We also do the Burdens of Blessings teaching as well. We're currently booking our 2021 Burdens of Blessings tour. We'd love to bring this transformational message and present it with you in your church or your area. Please call us, contact us at Karen@kimcrabill.org to learn more about that. Well, here we go, our last 30 minutes of the show. It goes by so quickly, but I always feel like it's so important for you to know who it is that you're talking to, hear the heart of the person who's talking, and you've gotten lots of good information already. But we're going to welcome Jim back, and we're going to talk about 5 reasons that we can trust the Bible. Jim, I've read so many of your books. Which book do we find that in? I'm so sorry that I don't know.
No problem. We're going to talk about stuff out of Cold Case Christianity. That's the book that actually makes the case for Christianity, and that was part of what I had to do. So when I first encountered the Gospels, I really had no background, really much knowing what to expect. I just kind of knew like the little quotes and bits and pieces that are kind of culturally out there that people would cite from Scripture. So I was kind of surprised to find that the Gospels read as though these people who wrote them want us to believe they saw this stuff. And so I was able to test it. And I remember my cold cases are cases that maybe 30, 35 years ago. I've got cases as early as 1972. In those cases, often your witnesses are dead, and even the initial officers who took the supplemental reports from the witnesses, they're sometimes dead. So you end up with reports where you're trying to figure out what happened, but you got no access to the officer who wrote it, and you got no access to the witness he was interviewing. Well, that's what's happening in the Gospels. I have no access to the people who wrote it, and I have no access to whoever's there quoting. So I've got to make a decision, is this true? And I'm using the same techniques you would use in a criminal trial. This is all I had in my mind in order to a template, basically, that I could use. This is what my experience was. The first reason why you can trust your Bible is the first reason why I would trust any eyewitness. Was the witness really there to see what he said he saw? Because the easiest way to lie is to simply wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say anything you want. And this is true for Jesus as well. So how early are the Gospels? Were they written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, or at least to have been written at a time when eyewitnesses would know if they were lying? And most skeptics will claim that the Gospels are written 100 years later, so they're not eyewitness accounts, but that's not actually true. They are very early, and you can tell this from the evidence in the Gospels, right? You have the book of Acts, which is missing key elements of history. It's missing, for example, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem around 70 A.D. It's missing the entire clash between the Jews and the Romans starts around 66 A.D. So it's missing all that data. It's missing the death of Peter. He's alive at the end of the book of Acts. Well, we know that the death of Peter occurs in the mid-60s. It's missing the death of Paul. We know when Paul is still alive at the end of the book of Acts. It doesn't cite the death of Barnabas or James, the brother of John. These key people who died in the 60s, from about 60 to 65, their deaths are not described, even though Luke, who writes the book of Acts, does describe the death of Stephen. He describes the death of James, the brother of John. These are minor players compared to the big ones I just mentioned. James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and Peter are the three top characters in the book of Acts. Why wouldn't Luke describe their deaths? Well, we could test this. If they hadn't happened yet, you couldn't describe it. So if he's writing this in around 60 A.D., you would not be able to describe the things I just mentioned because they haven't happened yet. Now, Luke writes two books. He writes the Gospel of Luke before the book of Acts. That means the book of Luke has to be written sometime before 60, and I think there's good evidence in Scripture because Paul quotes the Gospel of Luke in his letter to the Corinthian church around 53, when telling them that they ought to do the Lord's Supper in a particular way. He cites Luke's version of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians. But he writes that in the early 50s. Even skeptics will agree that's his book, written in the early 50s. That means that Luke's gospel is already available to him in the early 50s. And Luke quotes more than any other source. He tells us he's not an eyewitness to the Gospels. He's an eyewitness to the book of Acts, okay? But he's not he didn't know those people back before the book of Acts. And he says this in the first chapter of his book. And he says that he is going to quote those who were actual eyewitnesses. And the person he quotes more than anyone else is the Gospel of Mark. But that means that Mark's Gospel has to be even earlier than 53. Now you've inched this thing back to within 15 to 20 years. And you might ask, well, why didn't they write it right away? Why wait even 15 to 20 years? Well, because I do think they believed that Jesus would return in their lifetime. And it's interesting to me that about the same time that the first martyr, James, the brother of John, dies around 44, 45. It's about that time that we start to see the Gospels appear. I think once they realized they weren't getting out of this alive, they started to write these things down. But it passes the first test. It's early enough. Let me jump quickly to the second test. Has it, can it be corroborated in some way? Well, yes, we can corroborate this in a number of ways. You can even corroborate if I had no external evidence, if I didn't have any archaeology. For example, the Book of Mormon cannot be corroborated with a single piece of archaeology from the North American continent. It describes 1,000 years of history in the North American continent, from about 600 B.C. to about 400 A.D., and there's not a single archaeological find that supports any of it. People groups, weapons, monetary systems, cities. There are no maps in the Book of Mormon because they cannot locate any of the locations that are described. But that's not true for the New Testament. We have all of these. There's a great series that right now called The Chosen, in which they are reenacting the story of Jesus. I suggest anyone who's hearing this, they should watch that series. You can start it on YouTube for free right now. But the point is, you can recreate the scenarios because they're real scenarios. And also there's internal evidence. I use a process called forensic statement analysis with bad guys where I'm looking for deception indicators in their written statements. Well, I applied this to the Gospels to see if they were internally consistent. You can corroborate the Scriptures, and I've read about this in Cold Case, but the point is You can corroborate them with a number of different lines of evidence, both internal. For example, the names that the authors use, the names of men, Jewish men and Jewish women in the first century in Egypt, it turns out, are very different than the names of Jewish men and Jewish women in the area of Jerusalem in the first century. And so if you were writing these Gospels from Egypt or from North Africa, you wouldn't even know what names to use. But it turns out the authors of the Gospels actually used the right names because they're writing in the region at the time they said they were writing. There's lots of ways to do that. But let's go to the third real quick. And that is, has their story changed over time, or have they been honest and accurate? Because the idea is, if there's a gospel that said something about Jesus in the first century, well, it's been changed for 300 years before it even gets to the Council of Laodicea, where they decide which gospels to put in the Bible. How do we trust that Jesus wasn't some simple preacher who never worked miracles and never rose from the dead, but all of that stuff was added over time? The legend of Jesus, this is the theory that Jesus is a simpler version of Jesus is true, and that the Christ of Christianity is simply a legend that was created. Okay. Well, it turns out you can test that using what we call in law enforcement the chain of custody. And what that means is if I've got – what's that?
I was just saying that again so people could write it down because that's big. Chain of custody.
Yeah, chain of custody. Right, because if we have a case from 30 years ago and we have some piece of evidence in the crime scene, and then 30 years later we bring it in a trial, the argument is going to be, well, you modified it. I mean, if whatever you said was true about it, you could have changed that over the years until now I have this bad piece of evidence that's been tampered with. Well, the question we ask is, okay, was there an officer at the scene who saw that piece of evidence and maybe photographed it or wrote a really comprehensive report about it? Because that would give us a snapshot of what it was like in the beginning. And then he's going to give it to somebody who's going to be required to write a report about what he received from the first officer. His report better match, and then he's going to bring it to the crime lab, and their report better match his report, and then that's going to be released some years later to another detective who will write another supplemental report describing what he received from the crime lab, and now we've got report after report after report and image after image after image over the years connecting the past to the present. And each officer and each scientist or criminalist acts as a link in this chain, and this is called the chain of custody. We have to show who handled this over the years. Well, it turns out there's a chain of custody in the New Testament because someone like John, for example, when he's writing his gospel, he had students who sat at his feet. Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias were 3 students of John. Well, these people ended up being important in history, and they led local congregations, they led local regions. So we could ask them, well, what did John teach you? Because it turns out those folks wrote letters in which they describe the teaching of John. And you could look in those letters to see if the Jesus character is simpler. In other words, they'll tell you right away how John described Jesus. Did John describe Jesus being born of a virgin? Did he describe him rising from the dead? Did he describe him walking on water and doing all these miracles? Or is the version that John's students repeat, is that version simpler without any of the miracles because they're going to be added later in history? So we can look at those documents. I've read all of them. And they all pretty much agree. They all agree in terms of the miraculous nature. Oh, my gosh. And unfortunately, the virgin birth and all the miracles and the resurrection, those are the earliest components of the story. And while those letters from the students may not have every detail, they certainly contain those. And then they've got a student, Irenaeus. He repeats what his masters taught him. He's got a student, Hippolytus. He repeats what Irenaeus taught him, and so on and so on and so on. Now you can at least see, is the story of Jesus growing more legendary and more robust, or is it pretty much the same story every single generation? And what you'll find is it's the same story every single generation. The story is early, it does not change over time, and it can be corroborated. Here's number 4. Do the authors, does your witness possess a bias that would cause him to lie? By the way, these 4 things I'm telling you so far are the exact way we test eyewitnesses in criminal trials. I'm just using the jury instructions.
That's what's so fascinating to me is how you've taken your original occupation and scooted it over to what you're doing now. It's fascinating to me. So continue on.
Well, and I just wanted to show you this is the template that we actually use because they're in the California jury instructions. So the last piece of this, number 4, is possessive bias. Now, I will tell you that most people don't understand motive, but motive comes down to 3 things. Only 3 things ever cause anyone to do something they shouldn't do. If it's a murder or it's a theft or it's just a lie, it's only caused by 3 motivations. Here they are: financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power, which is a huge bucket of motive that is very nuanced. So when someone comes in and says, walks into a business and shoots people who are a different race or a different belief system, that's a pursuit of power issue. That's that I think that my views are more important. Who I am is more important than who you are. That's a power, authority, respect issue. And that's where we get into a lot of trouble. So the question then becomes, if the witness is lying to you, he's going to be driven by one of those 3 things. And if the authors of Scripture are lying to us, they're going to be driven by one of those 3 things. That's what drives every lie. Well, they're driven by, I cannot find motive in the disciples in either sex, money, or power that would explain why they would lie, especially when they didn't even have the power to control their own deaths. And Paul, who writes most of the New Testament, was already in a position of authority and respect as a Jew. Why would he leave that?
That's right.
Jump in with a smaller group and work for years to get back to where he already started. This makes no sense at all. And so the lack of
just
motive.
Just the opposite.
That's right. And the final thing I want to tell young people, and number 5, is that the 5th reason is that if you will actually work criminal cases like I do, you will discover that the Bible describes the world the way it really is. In other words, I've worked in cases where people don't understand the enigma of man, how humans could be so delightful yet so capable of horrific crime. Like they would say, well, this guy could never do such a thing. I hear this all the time working cold cases. I arrest somebody. For 30 years, he's been the deacon at the church. He's lived next door to you. He's watched your kids. There's no way that guy could have killed his wife 30 years ago. That makes no sense unless you believe the Christian narrative, unless Christianity is true, which describes all of us. No one seeks after God. We are all wicked. Our best works are filthy rags to God compared to what God is. And all of us are deeply fallen, capable, created in the image of God, capable of greatness, but deeply rebellious. And so you'll see in the same person this enigma of 2 different kinds of behaviors, 2 different kinds of personas. It's not that he's duplicit. So we're all duplicit because this is the nature of humans as they're described on the pages of Scripture. And so the 5th reason why I think you can trust your Bible is that it tells you not only that the universe is created the way it is, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, and no one's got an excuse in Romans 1 to think that there's no God, because the pages, you have 2 books that God has given you. One is the book of Scripture, the other is the book of nature, and both of these books, they agree. And this is what's so powerful, I think, for young people to see, that the Bible does describe the world the way it really is. So I would say those 5 things. I wanted to get them out quickly so you can have some time to answer questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're having some, I think, maybe some technical problem in getting some questions through. I'm not sure what is happening. But anyway, with the things that you have just written down there, I hear everyone saying this. I hear parents saying this. But, Jim, how do I do this? How do I start building this into my child? And I love that you have a cold case Christianity for kids, because it has to start there. Don't you agree? It has to start there.
Yeah.
So you're meeting, you have put something out here that parents can help. So to get to the place of where you are or where someone is that knows this, then we have to start early. So let's speak to that. Parents are sitting at home going, not only do I need this, I need to start building this into my children. Where do they start, Jim? How do we begin?
Well, yeah, and again, it's not about my books or any products that are out there. It's really, I'll say first of all, look, you already have some passion in your life that just oozes out and it permeates your conversations. So let's say, for example, here in Southern California, if you're a guy living in Southern California, we've got more professional sports teams here than probably about anybody. Two football teams, 2 baseball teams, 2 basketball teams, and people out here can make an argument for why their team is the better than the counter team. They actually can talk about the entire history of the draft and who's coaching and what the coaching staff, how deep it is, and who's played there in the past and what their schedule is going to be this year. We already there's shows on TV which I even watch that'll talk about the upcoming NFL schedule. That's what they're talking about, and they've got all these different. Really, now if you're interested in those kinds of things, well then you can't help it when you sit down at dinner. That you're probably going to say something about your passion for sports, and your kids know already what it is you're interested in, because it's the kind of stuff the conversation almost always gravitates toward. So I will say one thing, that the first thing that has to change is we have to be as interested in our Christian worldview, in the things of God, as we are in our hobbies, in our careers, in our backyard, whatever it is that we are spending time and talking about. So if you're just geeked out on something, you're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. And then your kids are going to probably end up being geeked out about it too. And this is and so, for example, you'll see that there are studies that have been done, and we talk about these studies, and so the next generation will know, in which young people are far more likely to stay in the faith if, for example, they have served on missions trips with their parents. If, for example, they have seen their parents share the gospel with strangers. In other words, it's just the same old mechanism that transfers passion in every other area. When you're if you're raised a Dodgers fan, you will be attending Dodgers games with your kids. Well, where'd you get that from? Well, I went with my dad. There's the thing we have to do. It's about transferring passion. So a lot of this is going to be not about, I want you to add another thing to your life that you're not really passionate. No, I'm asking you to exchange some area of passion for the stuff that really matters. And that can be convicting. I get that. And it can be difficult, and it needs to start really early. I think we wrote a kids series of all of our books are available in kid form at casemakersacademy.com, casemakersacademy.com. And I just posted the latest graduates there's an honor cadet wall there where you can go and see that people who have used. It's an entire academy for each book in which they can earn a graduation certificate and become like junior detectives. But they're going to be examining a mystery and the case for Jesus, or the case for God, or the case for evangelism. But there's also going to be a mystery in each book that they have to solve, and I think that's what kind of drives those books. But my point is...
Absolutely. The hands-on.
Yeah, but we want to start early. That's 8 to 12. You got to start early.
Yeah, and I love that. I love the Detective Cadet Academy. And for listeners, please, all of this is going to be posted on my website, and I'm also and my Facebook. But we do have a caller now, Jim. So I want to bring in caller 1105. Caller 1105. Welcome to Coffee.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This is Yale.
Good morning.
This is Yale. Hi, this is Yale. How are you?
Good to talk to you, Yale. Looking forward to
talk to you. It's been I had to hold myself back from calling in earlier because I'm practicing listening more than talking and asking questions. But I do appreciate what you're saying, and for me, like listening to you, it is a geek out session. Like I can write down the 5 things but I'm having a problem implementing it, especially when you have like a 30-second opportunity to feel like you have to turn somebody back on path or turn somebody to where you're headed. So I guess I have 2 questions. One is, despite everything that you've learned and gathered, have you ever sat back and said, this particular thing I'm questioning my beliefs. I'm questioning what's going on here. That's my first question. And the second question is, I guess, do you go into certain situations saying my end result is going to be making this person understand and agree with what I'm saying? I guess those are my 2 questions.
I'm going to answer both of those for you. Yeah. So the first thing is I think sometimes the rules of evidence, if you work in criminal trials long enough, there are certain rules of evidence that help jurors assess the evidence. We don't just throw the evidence at them. We actually instruct them with certain rules. And those rules have been helpful for me. So, for example, it's helped me to manage doubt. Also, remember, I didn't become a believer until I was 35. I had 35 years of more than just doubt. I had 35 years of just, no, it's not true. So by the time I got here, a lot of those issues were already worked out. They were in my rearview mirror. But I will tell you this. What happens is that the rules of evidence have helped me to manage doubt as well. Here's what I mean. The idea that there's a difference between possible doubt and reasonable doubt, that I'm not trying to convince a jury beyond a possible doubt because I could never do that. And I have to explain that to jurors before we start. If you're the kind of person who has to have every possible doubt removed, you're not going to be able to serve on a criminal trial because the standard is lower than that. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. The jurors are instructed that there are many. I could level any possible or imaginary doubt against anything you believe. The question is that a reasonable doubt that I've just leveled? So we have to have that standard. The standard is lower for me on any of these major issues. For example, we tell jurors that if you think you have to have every possible question answered, are you the kind of person who has to have no open questions before you can render a verdict or make a decision? Yeah, I think I'm the kind of person, I do. I'm nitpicky about that. I need to have every question answered. Well, you're excused because there's no way I can put you on a jury. I've never been able to answer every possible question on any criminal trial. I had a case where the woman was killed by her husband, and he got rid of her body. I couldn't even produce a body. I had no idea where she was, where he buried her, how he killed her, how he moved her car. I couldn't answer the most important, but I could demonstrate that he did it with those open questions. They convicted him. He later on confessed to where the body was. But the point I'm trying to make is, I know that, do I have open questions still? Yeah, of course. The question is, look, as an atheist, I could not tell you how the universe came into existence, why it appears to be fine-tuned for a carbon-based life like ours, how life originated from non-life, how the life that does originate appears to be designed. That's not even controversial. Biology has the appearance of design. How it is you have an immaterial mind in the existence of a material universe that can make free choices where if it's a material universe, these would all be determined in advance by physics. How it is we have objective moral standards when everything really, what's the objective standard, transcendent standard if we believe in objective moral truths? But there is apparently. Well, as a matter of fact, we even think that there is a standard of righteousness that is objective by which we could judge something and call it truly evil. So I couldn't answer the question on any of those, yet I held on to my atheism. It turns out that I still have some open questions, but I have fewer of them as a Christian than I had as an atheist. I have now answers for all of those. Now, if you come across something in the Bible, you're like, I'm not quite sure how to reconcile that. Well, get over it, okay? This is the nature of every claim. There will always be open questions, and we have to move past those. Now, the second thing, which was, remind me again, that was, the idea of how do I feel like I need to bring everyone to I don't think this is a game of tennis, right? This is not a game of tennis. I talk about this in Forensic Faith, where you're hitting the ball across, and you've got 30 seconds to bring this guy to the foot of the cross. You've got 30 seconds to bring this guy to Jesus.
Right.
No, actually you don't, because this is a game of baseball, not a game of tennis. It's not just you and the other guy one-on-one, mano a mano. It's not that way. It's actually that you are part of a larger team. And when you are talking to somebody, you have to resist the temptation to hit home runs, to swing for the fences. You might sense that this is the time to swing for the fences. But what I've learned is that you don't know where people are on the base path. And my goal is just to advance the runner, because it's a team sport. I got someone coming up behind me who's going to get a chance to hit as well. And my goal is to get off the bench, make contact with the ball, but and leave the results to God. So that when somebody appears to make no progress at all in my conversation, you don't know. You might have moved him 10 feet from first to second. You don't know. And you won't know in that conversation. And by the way, so that takes for me a little bit of the pressure off. But also, if this person comes to faith right in front of you, like all of a sudden wants to hear the gospel and then accepts the gospel, it controls my pride, because I know that wasn't me. That was 10 years of other people bunting and making contact with the ball, who had moved this guy around the base path until finally he was 10 feet from home plate, and all I did was bunt him in. And so it helps me, number one, not to beat up on myself when I don't seem to make any progress, and number two, not to feel too prideful when I do. So I think that to remember that this is a game of baseball instead of a game of tennis is helpful.
Wow, that was good. I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Kim, for having him on.
Absolutely. And, Jim, this is my friend Yael that I was telling you about. That is a local prominent attorney in town. So it was fun having your question, Yael. So thank you so much.
Yeah, good talking to you
guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and we could go on and on. Unfortunately, here's the sad part, Jim. We're down to about 3 minutes, and so what I would like for you to do, and again, I want to thank you so much. I feel like I wish I'd asked for permission just to keep on going for another hour, but I would love to have you back at some point. I really do want to bring you to Baltimore, and I do annual conferences here where people come in from all around, so I'd love to bring you back and be able to talk in person with people. But with just 2 or 3 minutes left, to the person out there who is just completely, it's like the world and the way it is right now has them doubting everything. They're so confused about everything, and there's a lot of that going on. Statistics will bear that out. If we're turning to alcohol, we're turning to old addictions, where the abuse rates are going, crazy. People are walking away from marriages. We're just losing everything. Bring us back. Give our listeners a word of hope about how they can come back and really center themselves on Christ to stand through this very difficult time.
Well, it seems like a lot of this is about focus, right, and what it is we choose to focus on. And we're in a unique situation, and Gen Z has to be, in some ways, have a lot of empathy for Gen Z, because this is a generation that cannot avoid, nothing is private. All their thoughts have to be posted on social media. All their actions have to be posted on social media. If you don't, then you're considered to be, not with us on certain issues, or, you're not part of the group. So this is the highest level of groupthink that we're ever going to have, is driven by our social media environment. And there are times when, if you don't control the funnel through which all information comes to you, you're going to be overwhelmed and feel like it's hopeless. And that's why I think that it is probably time for us to have a Sabbath from social media, from the world around us. And maybe one of those, like a week long, where you're going to need to kind of step out and get your balance back. I try to avoid those situations that distract me. I'm not a political creature by nature, but I also know that politics is downstream of something that's more important. We disagree on many political issues across the country because we don't believe the Bible is true, and some of us will not turn to the Bible for our answers, or we believe the Bible is true, but we don't take it seriously. So my work is centered on those other issues. Is the Bible true, and should we take it seriously? And then the secondary issues of politics, of even what we're seeing in our culture right now, those issues are grounded for me on the first 2 issues. Is the Bible true, and should we take it seriously? When I say take it seriously, not to cherry pick out a verse to support a position, but to actually know what the entire counsel of God is on any particular topic. And then if we do that, we will end up agreeing on how to solve problems in culture. But right now, we're in a noisy environment that is screaming at each other without even going so far as to dive deep into these issues. And that's why I would say now is the time, instead of to open your news every morning and read all the articles to see what's going on in the culture, let's open your scripture every morning and read all the verses that tell us how to navigate culture. That's where we need to spend our time. It's about focus right now. I guarantee you, if you took 2 weeks and did not pay attention to the world around you, the world is still going to turn. And you are going to become more grounded in your faith if you stay in the scripture during that time.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, I love that. What a challenge for each and every one of us. And it really does. It shifts the focus. I feel like I've been living by the Peter principle lately. It's like when I'm involved in it and I start to sink into despair or hopelessness or just confusion, it's like you call out to the Lord and He's right there to lift you up. But it's all on that focus. King Jehoshaphat, when we don't know what is going on around us, but we know we can keep our eyes on Him, right?
That's right.
Jim, and I've got just a few seconds, but I want to ask you a question. If we could peek into the heart of J. Warner Wallace as an atheist versus the J. Warner Wallace that we see now, what would the difference be?
Well, I think sometimes I think it really is it's a sense of my own fallenness, a sense of what grace really is. The people I find who are the most unforgiving are the people who think they have nothing to be forgiven for. And the more you realize how much you need to be forgiven for, the more forgiving you can become. And that's really needs to be the focus. It's on the grace of God. If you focus on the grace of God, you may not always perform well, because we're not practically perfect. We're positionally perfect right now. I am not perfect, so there's lots of mistakes I'm still going to make. But God somehow, through His grace, is looking at Jesus instead of me. So that's, I think, the difference.
Wow. That's a great way to end on. It reminds me of Ephesians 2:8. For it's by grace we've been saved through faith and not from ourselves. It is a gift of God. What a beautiful way to end this hour. Jim, thank you again so very much for sharing with us. You have been a light in the midst of this darkness and a lot of hope in the midst of a lot of people's helplessness. So thank you again so much, friend, and I look forward to a follow-up. So listeners, for coffee, I know that you've enjoyed this. Know that it's going to be on podcast soon. Thank you for being a part of our show, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks, Jim.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
To learn more about Kim's books, teaching materials, or to invite Kim to speak at your event, please visit kimcrabill.com. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, to learn more, please visit kimcrabill.com.